We read this morning from the book of Job, chapter 38, verses 1 through 11. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding, who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stopped. In case you have never met him, let me introduce you to Job. I really want you to get to know Job. Have you read the book of Job? It would be a shame to miss it, because all over the world it is regarded as one of the great meditations on the question of suffering. And it's right here in our Bibles, no extra charge. Of course, like a lot of the Old Testament, the book is mostly poetry, and poetry takes patience. It's ironic that we might not have the patience to read Job when the only thing most of us have ever heard about Job is that he was patient, right? King James Bible, book of James, chapter 5, verse 11, ye have heard of the patience of Job. Now, if you want to know Job as much as I want you to know Job, let me start with that misconception. Job was not patient. Not if patient means, as one dictionary offers, I'm going to quote this, the bearing of provocation, annoyance, misfortune, pain, etc., without complaint, loss of temper, irritation, or the like. The Greek word that the King James translators rendered as patience, in many other translations is rendered as endurance or perseverance. A venerable 19th century Greek lexicon defines this Greek word as the characteristic of a man who is unswerved from his deliberate purpose and his loyalty to faith and piety by even the greatest trials and sufferings. You can be unswerved from your deliberate purpose and your loyalty to faith and piety and still lose your temper. Job certainly does. When terrible things begin happening to Job, he doesn't just sit there bearing provocation without complaint. He does complain for chapters and chapters in the most eloquent and excoriating language. But that's the poetry part. That's the part that few people read. Probably the reason people think Job was patient is because in the first chapter, before the poetry part, it says that when Job lost all his servants and all his flocks and finally all 10 of his children, his response was to fall on the ground and worship. But is worship the same thing as patience? Job's worship doesn't seem like patience. It seems more like desperation. A desperate cry that acknowledges his utter dependence on a power he cannot understand. Job worships because worship is all he has left. Another thing to know about Job. You've probably heard that Job argues with God. Really, he mostly argues with three friends, as well as an uninvited young whippersnapper who wanders onto the scene late in the book spouting platitudes. With these antagonists, he argues about God. In the course of these arguments, Job composes passionate laments he wants God to hear. Convinced that he is a victim of injustice, Job even imagines what he would say if only he could get God into court. He knows he would lose. He just wants to be heard. As he argues with his friends, Job is also arguing with scriptures. The earliest parts of the Old Testament, the parts that were created centuries before the book of Job, bear the marks of a sort of if-then theology that's centered in the book of Deuteronomy. It sounds something like this. If you keep the law of Moses, you'll live long and prosper. If you don't keep the law, you will suffer. Now, the arguments against this theology begin well before Job. For example, you can find them in the voices of prophets like Jeremiah when he cries, "Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease?" But by the time we get to Job a century or two later, the argument is white hot because for Job it is very, very personal. No one has tried harder than Job to keep the law. The text says he was blameless and upright. He feared God and turned away from evil. He kept all the prescribed rituals, and he even made offerings on behalf of his 10 children, just in case they had sinned in any way. And yet, in the space of less than a day, his entire world crashed down upon him. I recently read some article that said something about how people turn to religious faith in an attempt to control their destiny. That does not sound like the faithful people that I know. In my experience, people come to faith not expecting that they can control what happens to them, but to make meaning out of what happens to them, both the lovely and the terrible. People of faith are smart and honest enough to know that every life contains both the lovely and the terrible. The American religious scholar Bart Ehrman says that humanity's biggest question is, why do we suffer? But surely part of the work of faith is accepting that suffering often comes without a why. So with due respect to Dr. Ehrman, I think there may be a bigger question. Are we alone in our suffering? Put another way, does anybody care? "Teacher," cried the disciples to Jesus in the middle of the storm, "do you not care that we're perishing?" Let's shift a minute to think about that story from the Gospel of Mark that Margaret read today. A couple of years ago, I was preparing a sermon on that text, and if some of you are keeping track, yes, you have heard this little bit of this sermon before. It's important to me. I noticed that at that moment when the disciples woke Jesus up, they didn't have any reason to believe that he could stop the storm. If you read in Mark up to that point, the disciples have seen Jesus heal people, but they haven't seen him do weather. When Jesus does stop the storm, it doesn't seem to be what they were expecting. So what were they expecting? What were they asking for? Maybe all they wanted was for him to wake up and care. And in a way, that doesn't seem so different from what Job was asking. On the other hand, Job does make some other requests. For example, he would really like an explanation. Certainly, he cries for vindication. Distinct from the disciples, at one point, Job actually asks God to go to sleep and stop caring about him because he feels that God's caring is actually God singling him out for destruction. But for someone who asks God to stop noticing him, Job is working awfully hard to get God to see him, shouting in his imagined legal challenge, "Here is my signature, let the Almighty answer me." Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stopped. And God goes on and on in a grand creation hymn that is sung by the Creator. By its end, this hymn will have taken in the sweep of creation from the ordinances of the heaven to the calving of the deer. And to this great catalog of God's mighty works, the listener's response must be the overwhelming reverence felt in the presence of immeasurable power. The word for that reverence is awe. Job hurls his desperation into the whirlwind, and what comes back is the gift of awe. The same thing happens to the disciples in the Gospel of Mark. They were no more patient with Jesus in the middle of that storm than Job was patient with God in the middle of his. They hurled their desperation into the whirlwind. Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing? Couldn't that be called worship? That cry of desperation, asking God to see. And like Job, the disciples received out of the whirlwind a gift of awe. Who then is this, they ask one another, that even the wind and the sea obey him? In a hymn sung to provoke awe, it is perfect that God begins with the imagery of birth, because anyone who's witnessed to birth can tell you it is awesome every single time. In stories more ancient than the oldest words of the Bible, the sea is a god or a force or a type of monster to be conquered. But here in Job, God does not battle or conquer the sea. God catches the sea when it is born. And then God makes the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling bands. God swaddles the sea like an infant and then holds it, murmuring, peace be still. God is not conqueror of the sea with all its capacity for storm. God is midwife to its birth. Now, the Old Testament pays special attention to the powers that are unleashed when boundaries are broken. And birth is a boundary-breaking event. When new breaks into old, when unknown breaks into known, then everything feels unstable, nothing is safe, and consequently everything is possible. Birth is the beginning of possibility, and possibility is the beginning of hope. Jürgen Moltmann wrote, "Hope alone is to be called realistic, because hope alone takes seriously the possibilities with which all reality is fraught. It does not take things as they happen to stand or lie, but as progressing, moving things with possibilities of change. Thus, hopes and anticipations of the future are realistic ways of perceiving the scope of our real possibilities." Ye have heard of the patience of Job. Now hear of his worship. Worship is active engagement with God. Sometimes we engage with joy, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with impatience, sometimes with desperation. When we are desperate, worship is probably all we have left. The story of Job does not prescribe patient silence in the face of desperation. The story invites us to hurl our desperation into the whirlwind as worship, and so to receive the gift of awe. In awe, we do not presume to understand God or try to control God. Instead, we simply glimpse the grand scope of possibility that is in God. And possibility is how we come to hope. Thanks be to God. Amen.